Okay, there we go. Now we're working.
That was easy. If you have a Bible and you like to follow along, please turn in it to Matthew chapter 5. This is where we'll spend our time. One of the aspects of human nature that I find very interesting, and maybe that was an evidence for it right there, is that we don't seem to reckon with what's real in terms of what's right in front of us. In many instances, we will deny that which is in front of us as being real, and we'll live as though it's not. Now, that's not always bad. Sometimes that can be very good, that we choose to deny something that is real, say, for instance, if it's something that causes us great pain or great difficulty. But think about it like this. I have seen prisoners, there are plenty of YouTube videos of this, brought to the execution chamber and placed on the gurney. And right up to the point that the first syringe is plunged, and then the lethal chemical, the first chemical which just puts them to sleep, starts to flow into their veins, they are completely defiant of everything that has occurred, right up to the point that they're defiant that this all is in any way something that they actually are facing. I think about that. That's incredible to me. That somebody who's strapped down, this is it, you got 5 more minutes of conscious life in this world, is defiant of the fact that they've done something that's put them there. That's amazing to me. And yet, that can be so quickly changed when a phone call comes before the first syringe goes down, and it's the governor who presents them with a stay of execution. And all that defiance then melts into something like tearful gratitude. That looks so much like what it is for you and for me as we walk in this world as followers of Jesus. The more we see ourselves pardoned, the more we are melted into a different shape by God's Spirit. So let's take a look at this text and see what we could learn thinking in that way. I want to begin reading in Matthew 5, verse 1. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up to the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him, and he began to teach them, saying this, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." Now, how does this fit with the nature of humanity? Paul says our natures, who we are deep down inside, part of us, even those of us in this room who call the name of Jesus for salvation, there's a part of us that is simply at war with God. That's what Paul says. We are at war with God. And before we're born again, our whole being is at war with God. So is that condition of that Jesus describes here in being poor in spirit, mourning, and being meek, is that a spiritual condition, or is that merely a practice that we choose to take on? If Paul says this, he says to be meek in the biblical sense toward a person of greater station, like, say, for instance, a politician. I know we in America don't like that sort of notion, but looking back in history, kings and queens and those of royalty, that was the common condition. And Paul says very clearly, we are to give honor to whomever honor is due. So that's a biblical duty, that we're to behave in that way, in meekness towards somebody who is our superior in station. Not to say they're a better human being, but they have superiority in station. Then to be meek, say, between ourselves, is a kind of a courtesy that we offer. It's not an obligation necessarily, but we offer it to each other because of the affection we have for one another. So 2 human beings of similar station, if they are meek toward each other, they're doing a courtesy toward one another. That makes sense. But to offer meekness to somebody who is beneath us is to approach what I would call biblically a godly nobility, because we don't have to. This looks a lot like God in that sense. God doesn't have to be meek toward us in any way. He's under no obligation for that. The meek, a person who is biblically truly meek, they don't have to have meekness explained to them. And they don't have to be shown their place because they're already in it. So we come into this world, we get born again, we come into the world from birth to grow. We get born again to continue growth in some way. But our whole life course being one of growth, what are we growing toward? And children, I remember when I was little, if my mom didn't want me to get at something, all she had to do was put it up on a high shelf. That was all that was necessary, and that was the end of that for me because I couldn't get up to it. However, the distinction being that when we become born again, God lifts us up to the high shelf. We don't have to climb up, and we don't have things placed out of our reach by God in that sense. So, as I look at this beatitude, and this is only a small portion here of the overall Sermon on the Plain, Sermon on the Mount, this would have just been completely mystifying to all of the Jewish hearers who were standing there that day listening to Jesus. They would have had no mental matrix to plug this into simply because their whole history was one of Yahweh, the warrior God, driving out everybody before them. That's their history. God goes before them. He drives out everybody that resists the Jewish advancement into the world. And that's just the way they think. So the idea of blessed are the meek, blessed are the mourning, it makes no sense to the Jewish mind. I find it remarkable, especially given the fact that Jesus is Jewish, that this is what he says. I mean, think about it in terms of John chapter 8, where Jesus encounters the adulterous woman. The law is very clear. She's to be stoned. She's caught in the act of adultery. She's to be stoned. And Jesus denies them that act by asking the salient question, is anybody here without any sin? Go ahead and throw the rocks. Obviously not. But again, this is a place where these things show up in Jesus in ways that seem very counterintuitive to what you and I would think is a good life or a person of great stature of any kind. The hard thing here is that meekness, in the biblical sense, involves other people. That's the hard thing, because then we have to show ourselves to be a certain way under certain circumstances with people. And that's what makes this really hard. Biblical meekness can only show up in an encounter with another person. That's the only place it can show up. I mean, obviously, biblical meekness shows up in our spirit before God, but who in the world can see that? Until there's an encounter of some kind to show that out. Let me give you an example. I can stand here and I can talk about myself in showing you things about myself that aren't good. I can do that. We do that all the time, don't we? We say, well, you know, I'm stubborn, or I'm this, or I'm that. And we speak of the qualities we have that are bad qualities very freely. But let me put that into another perspective. What does it feel like when somebody else points it out to us? It feels real different then. How many times you go somewhere and you say, oh, that sermon stepped on my toes. What does that mean? It means that there was something in the person, the hearer, that the sermon and the quality of the words somehow raised up the point of thinking in themselves that maybe I'm not as good as I think I am. I mean, labeling failures is something we can do for ourselves, but it doesn't feel good when someone else does it at all. I'm allowing people in that moment to put a searchlight on me. And how does it feel? How do I react to that? Now, there are biblical examples of meekness. And biblical meekness is the only way the word should be defined. It's not some kind of mamby-pamby person who just gives in to everything, peace at all costs. That is not biblical meekness at all. Let me give you some examples. Abraham. It's funny, I was arguing with somebody online this morning about Abraham and Lot. They came to a place where their herds and everything became too big for the land. They just were both of them were too big. We've got to pick a direction to go and separate ourselves from each other. And Abraham, in his biblical meekness, looked at Lot and said, "You pick. I'll take whatever's left." Right? Lot looked over and saw the green and beautiful fields toward Sodom and Gomorrah. He went that way. Abraham looked over and took whatever was left, which was the more desolate west. That's biblical meekness. Gideon, he started out with thousands, and God whittled Gideon down in Gideon's meekness until he didn't have the thousands. He had to depend on something greater than his army. Moses, it says of Moses in Numbers chapter 3, he was the most humble human on the earth. Think about Moses and how that would apply to him. David, he's being pursued by Saul. He finds Saul in a cave asleep. He could easily rid himself of the problem of Saul, who wants to kill David. But he doesn't. He takes a piece of Saul's cloak, cuts it off, shows everybody, "I could have killed you, but I did not." Why? Because David was biblically meek. Jeremiah, great prophet, he's telling the people, if you don't repent, the Babylonians are going to come, they're going to burn everything. The other prophets, with the spirit of the day, not the spirit of God, tell the Jews, "No, don't listen to this guy. 2 years, we're out of here. God's going to bless us. Our warrior God Yahweh will drive the Babylonians out. We're going to be as we're supposed to be." Jeremiah says no. Jeremiah could have aligned his message with the popular message as well, but he did not. Why? Because he was biblically meek. Stephen could have kept his mouth shut, and the stones would not have been raining down on his head. Why did he speak up? Because he was biblically meek. That's why. Paul could have blown his horn. Pharisee of the Pharisees, born to the tribe of Benjamin, circumcised on the 8th day, and before the law blameless. That's quite a resume. He could have made a big deal out of that, but he chose not to. He said, "I'm the chief of the sinners." Why? Because he was biblically meek. None of these people exhibited what I would call natural predispositions. Something has happened in them. Something has made them different people than they are. Meekness is not peace at any cost. Ask Stephen. Ask Stephen. So, what do we learn from this and what Jesus has said here? One cannot be meek until one is poor in spirit. One cannot be poor in spirit unless they have some kind of view of themselves in terms of their own impoverished condition before God. What's the best definition of biblical meekness? I would say it's a true biblical view of oneself. When we truly have a biblical view of ourselves, we're beginning to look biblically meek. So how do we find it, what Jesus is presenting here? Well, I'd say it's difficult because there are lots of barriers all of us in this room have to biblical meekness. Here's an easy one to think about. Once you think you're meek, you've lost it. If I think myself meek, it's gone. You ever heard somebody talk about humility that way? If I think myself humble, I'm not. Just that simple. What's the problem? It's a problem every person in this room has. We all see ourselves moving through the world. We don't do things without a conscious awareness of self at all. It's just who we are. And it's almost as though we think ourselves, and I say this with reverence, to have a kind of self-omnipotence. Because we can move through this world and make our own choices, and we look at God, and what we really want a lot of the time is that God would bend His will toward ours. We want to be omnipotent in that sense. We make ourselves omnipotent in some ways by the fact of what we decide to pursue or not. We seek significance. This is incredible to me, and it's interesting in terms of studying the present generation. Now, I'm sure that you go back in time to our generation or Brad's generation or Tammy's generation or whoever's generation, and you can see similarities, but there's one thing that's very unique to this generation that come out of college today. And it's a big problem with employers right now. And that is, People come out of college and they settle into a job of some kind, and after a couple of months, they're wondering why they're not making a difference in the world. Well, gosh, I mean, you've only been there a couple of months. Most people spend a lifetime to make a difference in the world via what they do of some kind. They're looking for some kind of significance that's not available to them that quickly. We have a thirst for it. And we find ourselves, as we move through this world, at every turn kind of defeated in that thirst for significance. Why is that? Why would we find ourselves defeated? I think biblically speaking, it's very simple. Because God's not satisfied with just part of us. He's not. He wants all of us. He wants the whole bag. He doesn't just want a few pieces of candy out of the bag. He wants the bag. And that's you and me. And that's what defines growth. Once we're born again, growth is what? There's more of myself given over to Him as I go, and less of myself in needing some kind of significance just for me. The opposite of meekness then is self-assertiveness. That's the opposite of it. A true view of oneself biblically doesn't really want to be seen all that much. I don't think Stephen wanted to be seen that day when he preached the sermon that caused him to be stoned to death. He wasn't concerned about Stephen. He was concerned about the people to whom he was speaking. That was his concern. And I'll bet you, don't know this, but that was a moment where Stephen was not thinking of himself at all. I don't think he was thinking of himself at all. Meekness is a funny thing. It's like this. If you've got everybody in the room, I guess, knows what a plant called a succulent is. Succulents are generally very fragile. And a succulent comes up, say, in the forest floor, and maybe a limb or two above it in the canopy gets broken off by a storm, and the next day the succulent's exposed to the sun, and the succulent dies. Meekness is like that. Once we have some awareness in ourselves that we think ourselves to be meek, it's gone. It's gone. That self-awareness evaporates meekness. This is why we look at young children and we think of them as meek, because young children are just not that self-aware. They don't seem to be. There's some quality there that we just don't have anymore. But I wouldn't say we never have it. I think we do. But it's fleeting. That's why I'm convinced that when we stand in front of God, I'm convinced of it as I'm standing here. I see myself doing this. Sorry about that. But when I stand before God, the things that I've done that are going to matter and live and stand will be those things I had no awareness I was even doing. God used me in a moment. I wasn't aware I was being used. I was just doing, and I wasn't thinking of myself. John Bunyan said this. He said, a person who is down doesn't need to fear falling. I think that's pretty accurate. He should know he spent many years in prison and then wrote Pilgrim's Progress. So how do we understand this idea of meekness? The best way I can explain it is to tell a story. Now, one of the things about Jesus was he told stories. I love that. He told stories that, I don't know if he made them up. I'm assuming lots of them were part of Jewish history. Maybe some of them he made up on the spot because he was a pretty smart guy. I didn't make this one up. I wish I had. Then I could feel good about myself. but I didn't. But it really paints the picture of what biblical meekness actually is. So think about it this way. There was a ship, a passenger ship, caught in a storm, terrible storm. This is the kind of storm, a really big ship on the ocean is a very small object. That's so amazing to me. I've seen images of ships on the ocean, big ones, that encounter what's called a rogue wave, which is a wave that's 3 to 5 times taller than every other wave in the ocean during rough seas. And they happen because of convergence of moving water from several directions at once, and it stacks the water up so high that huge ships, tankers, are swamped by these waves. a ship on the ocean is a small thing. Well, this ship, passenger ship, was caught in this kind of storm. And the captain and the crew knew that this was real danger. This wasn't just, oh, it's a little rainy today. We could go down. And so they started working feverishly to make preparations such that this ship could survive the storm. Well, there was one passenger. I'm sure you've met this kind of person. They can't stay out of anything. They feel as though their opinion and their desire and their knowledge is so important that they've got to insert themselves into every situation that they find themselves encountering. Well, this was one of those passengers. So he goes to the captain and he says, "What are you doing about the storm?" The captain explains what he's doing, explains the processes. And this passenger is so insistent, he will not leave the captain alone. The captain says, "All right, I'll tell you what. I've got a job for you." The guy immediately feels better about himself. He says, he goes, takes him out on the deck, gives him a raincoat, says, "You see this rope?" "Yes." "Pull back on it." He pulls it back and it gets a little taut. It's a big rope. He doesn't know what it's hooked to. The captain says, "It's very important that you stay here and hold this rope until I come and relieve you. I will come, I'll relieve you, but do not release this rope until I come and relieve you." And he leaves him there and goes off. The guy's holding the rope. It's raining. After about an hour, he starts thinking, "I wonder if somebody's going to come take over for me here. I'm getting a little tired." But no, nobody comes and takes over. And to give the guy credit, he hangs onto the rope. The storm abates. The captain gathers the crew on the deck and lets everybody know that we're safe now. And this guy's still standing there holding the rope. And so the captain comes over and taps him on the shoulder. "You can release the rope now." He releases it. And then the captain just walks off. Well, this passenger says, "Wait a minute. How come he doesn't say something about me here? I'm the only passenger that came to help. Here I am. I held the rope. How come?" And he goes to the captain and says, "Why didn't you tell everybody that here's a passenger that held on to this rope? Probably helped to save the ship." The captain says, "Do you know why I had you hold the rope?" The passenger says, "I really didn't, because I didn't know what it was hooked to." He said, "The rope was hooked to nothing. I had you hold that rope so that no matter what happened, you wouldn't go overboard. And then we would have to stop saving the ship to get you, to save you." Sometimes the best thing we can do in service to God is to get out of His way. Just get out of His way. Think what that would do for you and me as we look at other people. If we thought of ourselves that we took Jesus seriously when He says, "Apart from me, you can do nothing." That's biblical meekness. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything